Hello and welcome back to A Christmas Carol Annotate with me. So we started on stave 3 in the last video, so we're continuing with that. In the last video we didn't actually make that many notes. It's important to remember that the areas that are heavily annotated are the areas that could potentially come up in an exam. So just bear that in mind because that's why I tend to go into a lot more detail in certain areas than I do others. This particular video will entail a lot of contextual knowledge, so AO3, so a lot about sort of Victorian England or how context fits into the text, and I'll be showing you how to sort of structure your responses a little bit as I am annotating today as well. So it might be a little bit longer than the usual videos, so you might want to pause here and go and grab yourself a hot drink so that you can get comfortable. Please do remember to obviously have your copy of the text with you, a highlighter, a pen, and also the revision booklet that we are making notes on and collecting key quotations on. So this is what the revision booklet looks like. If you haven't already, then the link for this revision booklet is in the description box, so feel free to print it out and copy the key quotations with us. Okay, so I will make a start. The ghost of Christmas present has arrived outside of the Cratchit household, and we are now going to be viewing the Cratchit Christmas. Then up rose Mrs. Cratchit, Cratchit's wife, dressed out but poorly in a twice-turned gown. So here we've got the description of what Mrs. Cratchit is wearing. So, but what we get the sense of is that Mrs. Cratchit tries her best to dress up because of that bit there, dress out, but doesn't succeed due to her poverty. So despite this, she still tries her best, showing her gratitude and her respect for her family. So she tries her best for her family. She tries to look nice on this particular occasion, and obviously she doesn't succeed because she's not got the money to wear nice clothes. We've also got this description here about it being twice turned. So this means twice turned means restitched twice, so highlighting again the poverty of the Cratchits. So throughout this we do see the poverty of the Cratchits, and it's something that I'm going to keep repeating and keep mentioning. And even if, I mean, you are unlikely to get this extract in the exam only because it has come up already, but it is something that you should be making mention of in the text because it shows poverty and it's something that you can link context to really well. But brave in ribbons which are cheap and make a goodly show for sixpence, and she laid the cloth, assisted by Belinda Cratchit, second of her daughters, also brave in ribbons. So brave in ribbons just means that they've got lots of ribbons on their clothes just to make them look nicer. While Master Peter Cratchit plunged a fork into the saucepan of potatoes and getting the corners of his monstrous shirt collar, Bob's private property, conferred upon his son an heir in honour of the day. So Bob's shirt has been passed down to Peter Cratchit, Bob's son, into his mouth, rejoiced to find himself so gallantly attired, and yearned to show his linen in the fashionable parks. And now two smaller Cratchits, boy and girl, came tearing in, screaming that outside the baker's they had smelt the goose and known it for their own, and basking in luxurious thoughts of sage and onion, these young Cratchits danced about the table and exalted Master Peter Cratchit to the skies, while he, not proud although his collars nearly choked him, blew the fire until the slow potatoes, bubbling up, knocked loudly at the saucepan lid, to be let out and peeled. So we've got the excitement of the Christmas day brewing here with the younger Cratchits, so Bob Cratchit's younger children. "What has ever got your precious father then?" said Mrs. Cratchit, "and your brother Tiny Tim, and Martha warn't as late last Christmas day by half an hour." "Here's Martha, mother," said a girl, appearing as she spoke. "Here's Martha, mother," cried the two young Cratchits. "Hurrah, there's such a goose, Martha." "Why, bless your heart alive, my dear, how late you are," said Mrs. Cratchit, kissing her a dozen times and taking off her shawl and bonnet for her with officious zeal. "We'd a deal of work to finish up last night." So here we see the oldest Cratchit daughter has been working on Christmas Day. It was actually quite common for people to work on Christmas Day, but obviously, particularly for the poor, it was even more so common. And So she's been working on Christmas Day and Christmas Eve and Christmas morning. Mrs. Cratchit doesn't even blink at this thought. So Dickens normalises this. So it was expected that Victorian children worked no matter when. I'm going to just give you some information, and you might want to make note of this section here because it will fall under a lot of areas of the text in terms of AO3 context. So I've got a little bit of information about child labour. So 80% of under 16-year-olds were in full-time work in Victorian England. Children from the age of 5 would be employed full-time every day. The 10 Hours Act was motioned to reduce the number of hours children could work to 10 hours per day. I mean, that's extortionate, just 10 hours a day, and that's a reduction. But Parliament rejected that proposal in favour of the opinions of employers and politicians. So it was rejected, so they continued to work for more than 10 hours a day. Following the 10 Hours Act being rejected, the Factory Act was passed, which regulated child labour but was not properly enforced. Only 4 inspectors were employed to regulate working conditions. So there were only 4 inspectors in the whole country employed to see that the factories worked well and they were fair and they were okay. And this was, I mean, quite a rigged system because obviously there was a lot of injustice, and obviously they couldn't get round fast enough to all of the factories, so there was a lot of neglect in that area. And it was regulated in this way so that it couldn't be enforced properly anyway. Ragged schools were set up in some warehouses and factories so children could attend school after a day's work. We get we get the implication of ragged schools later on in towards the end of stave 3 when we meet characters called Ignorance and Want. But obviously we already know from what we've had a look at in stave 2 that Dickens was extremely critical of the English schooling system anyway, and obviously he felt even worse about the ragged schools. So what I want you to do is, I would really like it if you could go and research ragged schools and Dickens's views on ragged schools, because that will really enhance your knowledge of the text and Dickens's views, and allow for you to incorporate some of your knowledge in your responses for your mocks, assessments and exams. Please let me know in the comments if you do go ahead and do that, and let me know what you found out. Well, never mind, so long as you are come. So Mrs. Cratchit just sort of shrugs it off, normalises it. She's used to Martha working, said Mrs. Cratchit. Sit ye down before the fire, my dear, and have a warm. Lord bless ye. No, there's father coming, cried the 2 young Cratchits, who were everywhere at once. Hide, Martha, hide! So Martha hid herself, and in came little Bob, the father, with at least 3 feet of comforter, exclusive of the fringe, hanging down before him, and his threadbare clothes darned up and brushed. So again we've got Bob has darned up his clothes to look seasonable, so to look impressive, to look nice. So he repairs his clothes to smarten them up for Christmas, to look seasonable, and Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Alas, for Tiny Tim, he bore a little crutch, and had his limbs supported by an iron frame. We'll speak about this little crutch later on, but it is symbolic of quite a lot of things. Where's our Martha? Cried Bob Cratchit, looking round. Not coming, said Mrs. Cratchit. Not coming, said Bob, with a sudden declension in his high spirits, for he had been Tim's blood horse. So here, Bob had been Tim's metaphorical blood horse. Another example of the affectionate relationship within the family. So Bob's been carrying Tim around because we know, you might be aware that he is disabled or unwell. We're not sure about what's wrong with him, but we just know he's really unwell. And as a result, Bob's had to carry him around all the way from church, and had come home rampant. Not coming upon Christmas Day? Martha didn't like to see him disappointed, if it were only in joke, so she came out prematurely from behind the closet door. So the Cratchits' affection for each other is again shown here. The joke that Martha plays by hiding away from Bob, pretending that she's not coming to Christmas, doesn't last long because she can't bear to upset him even in jest. and rather into his arms, while the two young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim and bore him off into the wash-house, that he might hear the pudding singing in the copper. "And how did little Tim behave?" asked Mrs. Cratchit, when she had rallied Bob on his credulity, and Bob had hugged his daughter to his heart's content. "As good as gold," said Bob, "and better. Somehow he gets thoughtful sitting by himself so much, and thinks the strangest things you ever heard. He told me, coming home, that he hoped the people saw him in the church because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant to them to remember upon Christmas Day who made lame beggars walk and blind men see." So here we've got Tiny Tim's reflection that he is happy to be seen on Christmas Day. And it's quite surprisingly mature for a young child. He doesn't hope to be seen to be pitied, so he doesn't want anybody to feel sorry for him. But he hopes to be seen to be able to remind people of the good that God has bestowed on them, so that they may be grateful for their own health and their own well-being. Bob's voice was tremulous when he told them this, and trembled more when he said that Tiny Tim was growing strong and hearty. So Bob's voice may tremble when he talks of Tim growing strong and hearty through pride, you could say, or perhaps because Tim isn't actually growing strong and Bob is scared of losing him. So there's different interpretations that you can come up with this, and it's really important that you do try to come up with your own interpretations whenever you can. His active little crutch was heard upon the floor, and back came Tiny Tim before another word was spoken, escorted by his brother and sister to his stool before the fire. Tiny Tim's active little crutch, like I mentioned before, it's something that I'm just going to quickly cover. So it could represent Tim himself. So he is resilient and determined and refuses to feel sorry for himself, and therefore he's this active little crutch. On a more sinister note, though, it could also symbolise the inadequate care that existed for the poor in Victorian England. So again, another reference to AO3 there. And while Bob turning up his cuffs, as if, poor fellow, they were capable of being made more shabby. So Bob's cuffs being incapable of being made more shabby is a detail, again to stress the family's poverty. Compounded some hot mixture in a jug with gin and lemons, and stirred it round and put it on the hob to simmer. Master Peter and the two ubiquitous young Cratchits went to fetch the goose, with which they soon returned in high procession. The Cratchit children carrying the goose in high procession is included to stress again the importance of the occasion to the family, and also the rarity of such expensive items being in their house. Such a bustle ensued that you might have thought a goose the rarest of all birds. This opening declarative of this passage confirms the end of the previous passage, that the good food is a rarity in this house. A feathered phenomenon, to which a black swan was a matter of course, and in truth it was something very like it in that house. Mrs. Cratchit made the gravy ready beforehand in a little saucepan, hissing hot. Master Peter mashed the potatoes with incredible vigour. Miss Belinda sweetened up the apple sauce. Martha dusted the hot plate. Bob took Tiny Tim beside him in a tiny corner at the table. The two young Cratchits set chairs for everybody, not forgetting themselves, and mounting guard upon their posts. So again, all of the Cratchits have different roles in the preparation of the dinner. So Dickens is showing us that even the act of preparing the dinner can be a family and shared experience for the Cratchits. It's also a scene to show Scrooge the importance of family and how being together and forming strong bonds is what brings joy. So it's a bit of a criticism of Scrooge's self-inflicted isolation. Crammed spoons into their mouths, lest they should shriek, for goose before their turn came to be helped. The image of the two young Cratchits cramming their mouths into their spoons into their mouths to stop themselves from screaming in excitement is very endearing. Dickens includes this display of good manners to challenge contemporary views of the poor, so to challenge the contemporary notions, so Victorian notions of the poor, and I'm going to go into a bit more detail about what the Victorians thought of the poor a bit later on in this video as well. At last the dishes were set on and grace was said. It was succeeded by a breathless pause as Mrs. Cratchit, looking slowly all along the carving knife, prepared to plunge it in the breast. But when she did, and when the long-expected gush of stuffing issued forth, one murmur of delight arose all around the board, and even Tiny Tim, excited by the two young Cratchits, beat on the table with the handle of his knife and feebly cried, "Hurrah!" So the Cratchits make one murmur of delight. So the unity of the family is again stressed here. It's really important to see the unity of the Cratchits family, because Scrooge is, remember, watching this, so he's supposed to notice their unity and his self-inflicted isolation. There never was such a goose, Bob said. Bob said he didn't believe there ever was such a goose cooked. So Dickens uses superlatives to exaggerate the Cratchit's appreciation of the goose here. Its tenderness and flavour, size and cheapness were the themes of universal admiration. So here there's more language to emphasise the unity of the Cratchit family. The goose receives universal admiration. Eked out by applesauce and mashed potatoes, it was a sufficient dinner for the whole family. Indeed, as Mrs. Cratchit said with great delight, surveying one small atom of a bone upon the dish, they hadn't ate it all at last. They every one had had enough, and the youngest Cratchits in particular were steeped in sage and onion to the eyebrows. But now the plates were being changed by Miss Belinda. Mrs. Cratchit left the room alone, too nervous to bear witness, to take the pudding up and bring it in. So now we're going to get a little snippet of Mrs. Cratchit's thoughts about the pudding. Suppose it should not be done enough. Suppose it should break in turning out. Suppose somebody should have got over the wall of the backyard and stolen it while they were merry with the goose. A supposition at which the two young Cratchits became livid. All sorts of horrors were supposed. This panic about what might have happened to the pudding clarifies how much this meal means to the Cratchits, and this use of repetition builds the sense of anticipation. So the repetition of suppose and suppose, I mean, it's not just repetition, it's also anaphora. So I'll just type it in here. An anaphora anaphora is a particular type of repetition. So it's the repetition of words or phrases at the beginning of sentences or clauses. So this repetition builds the sense of anticipation, exaggerating how much Christmas as a whole means to them. It contrasts with how Scrooge would be. If someone stole his pudding, he could simply just buy another one, but for them it's so precious because they can't just afford another one. Hello! A great deal of steam. The pudding was out of the copper. A smell like a washing day. That was the cloth. A smell like an eating house and a pastry cook's next door to each other, with the laundresses next door to that. That was the pudding. The presentation of the pudding is almost like a procession, celebrating something extremely precious. The way Dickens has structured the sentences with the delightful descriptions of the senses, followed by the clarification of what is being described, also builds the sense of anticipation of the Cratchits. In half a minute Mrs. Cratchit entered, flushed, but smiling proudly, with the pudding like a speckled cannon-ball, so hard and firm, blazing in half a quartern of ignited brandy, and bedight with Christmas holly stuck into the top. "Oh, a wonderful pudding," Bob Cratchit said, and calmly too, that he regarded it as the greatest success achieved by Mrs. Cratchit since their marriage. Mrs. Cratchit said that now the weight was off her mind, she would confess she had had her doubts about the quantity of flour. Everybody had something to say about it, but nobody said or thought it was at all a small pudding for a large family. It would have been flat heresy to do so. So the report of the comments from the Cratchit family also stresses how grateful the Cratchits are for Christmas, and as well as each other. It's really important that they're not just grateful for Christmas, but they're so grateful for one another. Again, they're shown as unified in their support of Mrs. Cratchit's efforts and concerns. It's important as well to see that Mrs. Cratchit was really worried that she wasn't sure if there was going to be enough flour. So something as cheap as flour, they can't afford it because of how poor they are. Scrooge is being shown these interactions. So again, he's being shown what he is missing out on with his miserly approach to life. Any Cratchit would have blushed to hint at such a thing. At last the dinner was all done. The cloth was cleared, the hearth swept, and the fire made up. The compound in the jug being tasted, and considered perfect apples and oranges were put upon the table, and a shovel full of chestnuts on the fire. Then all the Cratchit's family drew round the hearth in what Bob Cratchit called a circle, meaning half a one, and at Bob Cratchit's elbow stood the family display of glass. The family display of glass is there to remind us of the Cratchit's abject poverty again. So again, they're contrasted with Scrooge, and we're reminded that despite their difficult circumstances, they're still happy. 2 tumblers and a custard cup with a handle. These held the hot stuff from the jug, however, as well as golden goblets would have done. So this is a metaphor, or the use, you could say it's a hyperbole, the use of golden goblets to describe these cups. So these held the hot stuff as well as golden goblets would have done, reveals the good values of the Cratchits. The hyperbolic language shows how optimistic they are, and it is as a result of this optimism that they're happy and they're grateful. And Bob served it out with beaming looks, while the chestnuts on the fire sputtered and cracked noisily. Then Bob proposed, "A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears. God bless us," which all the family re-echoed. "God bless us, everyone," said Tiny Tim, the last of all. So this is quite an iconic quote from Tiny Tim. And it's actually quite important, because Tim, being the last to bless everyone, is there to remind us of Tim's sympathetic and giving character again, despite his difficult circumstances. But it's also important to notice that by using the inclusive pronoun everyone, Tim is seen as someone who does not discriminate and someone who believes that everyone is deserving of blessings and happiness. You could also argue that Tim is innocent of the knowledge that he's being denied help from the rich, and unaware of the fact that his suffering could be easily eradicated had the rich in the Victorian society taken more social responsibility. So this is the way. I've just shown you an example here of how you can both analyze language. So this here, you'd get marks for AO2, so the inclusive pronoun identifying techniques and then supporting it with a quotation. You'd also get marks for AO1. But then there's the mentioning of AO3, context here. So implementing context in this way makes it seem as though it just it's organic, as opposed to just adding it on at the end of your paragraph. If you were to just add it on throughout your response, it would be really, really good. And especially for grades 8s and 9s, it's important that your contextual knowledge is well integrated. He sat very close to his father's side upon his little stool. Bob held his withered little hand in his, as if he loved the child and wished to keep him by his side, and dreaded that he might be taken from him. So the image of Bob clutching Tim's hand is heartbreaking for readers, and is there for Scrooge to reveal the potential impact Scrooge could have on his employee if he changed his ways. So if he treated him better, if he paid him more, then Bob could look after Tiny Tim and get him the medicine that he so needs and deserves. But unfortunately, because of Scrooge's miserly nature and a lot of employers' natures and their capitalistic mindset, many employees were underpaid, and as a result they had to go through a lot of difficulty, and we see this particular difficulty in the representation of Bob and Tim. It's also important to notice, and these are really long notes, but again this will show you how to integrate your contextual knowledge, analyze language, identify techniques, use judicious quotes, so use well-judged quotes that carry a lot of meaning, as well as I'm going to show you how to relate it to the rest of the text. So I'll also let you know here as well, this copy of this annotated copy of A Christmas Carol is available. If you would like a copy of this, then please do make sure you comment or get in touch, and we will be happy to help you with that. Dickens's description of Tiny Tim's physical appearance and Bob Cratchit's love for Tim allows the reader again to reflect on the theme of social responsibility. So we've got lots of themes within this scene. We've got the theme of family, of relationships, of isolation, of unity, and also we've got the theme of social responsibility. For example, Tim is described as having a withered little hand, which shows the effect Tim's illness is having on him. Withered has connotations of decay, deterioration, and death, which make the reader feel empathetic towards Tim, as he is an amiable young child who is deteriorating due to the lack of medical support provided for him. The modern audience will feel even more sympathy in this situation, as we have access to provisions such as the NHS. The reader feels further empathy when we see that Bob held Tim's hand and dreaded he might be taken away from him, a clear sign of the love and affection Bob has for Tim, and the fear Bob has of his beloved son's death, and also the powerlessness he feels due to his poverty and inability to pay for medical help. Bob's holding on to Tim is symbolic of Bob's fear of losing Tim and his desperation to hold on to him for as long as possible. The semantic field of fragility is used to show how vulnerable and weak Tim is, and the use of this particular type of semantic field links Tim closely to Little Fan, who was also portrayed as a fragile young child. So remember, I made the connection between Little Fan and a Tiny Tim, but here I'm making the connection again. And it's important that you show that knowledge of that solid knowledge of the text by referring to um, other events or other key characters or other key areas in the text, because that gives you marks for AO1 as well as AO3. Dickens has created this connection between Fan and Tim in order to gain further empathy from Scrooge, who, we are told in an earlier stave, has lost his beloved sister. We see that the Ghost of Christmas Present succeeds in encouraging Scrooge to take more social responsibility later on when we finish this section, as Scrooge asks if Tiny Tim will live. So I'll actually carry on with this when we get to that stage. Spirit, said Scrooge with an interest he had never felt before. So Scrooge has never felt as interested in the message of the ghost as this particular message. Tell me if Tiny Tim will live. I see a vacant seat, replied the ghost, in the poor chimney corner, and a crutch without an owner, carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die. So the Ghost of Christmas Present is saying, if things don't change around this child's circumstances, then he will die. No, no, said Scrooge. Oh, no, kind spirit, say he will be spared. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, none other of my race, returned the ghost, will find him here. What then? If he be like to die, he had better do it and decrease the surplus population. So the ghost quotes Scrooge's own words from stave 1 when he spoke to the charity collectors back to him. Dickens has structured the novella to show the significant impact on Scrooge. So he expressed a shameful opinion, which many of his readers might have agreed with. So it's important to know that actually a lot of the people who have been reading this literature would have actually agreed with Scrooge at this point. They would have said they might as well just die if they can't afford to fend for themselves. So they would have been very Malthusian in their views. And if you're not aware of what the Malthus theory is, then please go back to the videos from stave 1, and I do cover it quite briefly there. Showing him a loving, well-mannered, well-meaning poor family closely linked to Scrooge, and then repeated Scrooge's shameful opinions back to him, now that he can understand the impact of his sentiment. So it's only harrowing for Scrooge now, because he's heard them horrible words spoken back to him, and he can only now realise how truly hurtful and harrowing it really is. Dickens uses dysphomistic language, so Dysphomistic language is harsh, abrupt language. It's the opposite of euphemism. In order to shock Scrooge and the Victorian reader. When Scrooge asks the ghost if the child will live, the ghost responds by saying, if these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die. So the ghost is telling Scrooge that if the rich, like him, do not change, then the poor will continue to suffer and their state of affairs will never change. The verb die is used to both shock and disturb Scrooge, so a tactic used to show Scrooge the consequences of his meagreness. Scrooge hung his head to hear his own words quoted by the spirit and overcome with penitence and grief. So he feels really remorseful and sad about what he said. Man, said the ghost, if man you be in heart, not adamant, forbear that wicked cant until you have discovered what the surplus is and where it is. Will you decide what men shall live, what men shall die? It may be that in the sight of heaven you are more worthless and less fit to live than millions like this poor man's child. O God, to hear the insect on the leaf pronouncing on the too much life among his hungry brothers in dust. So the ghost of Christmas Present questions Scrooge's notions of what the definition of the surplus is. So surplus means the excess or the leftovers. And in this case, it means the leftovers or the excess of society. So the poor who are seen as useless to society, the excess of society. There's no need for them. So the ghost of Christmas Present questions Scrooge's notions of what the definition of the surplus is, in an attempt to challenge Scrooge's ideas of who is deserving of having a place in society. Firstly, the ghost refers to Scrooge as man, indicating that Scrooge does not just represent himself, but he represents the rich as a whole. So this is a little bit of more of a accusatory tone that Scrooge uses here, almost accusing the contemporary readership of their own sins, their own selfishness, their own views. So Dickens is being incredibly critical here. The ghost then goes on to asking, will you decide what men shall live, what men shall die? Suggesting that people like Scrooge do not have the right to choose who should live and who should die, therefore challenging the idiotic nature of the Malthus theory. The ghost further states that it may be that in the sight of heaven you are more worthless and less fit to live than millions like this poor man's child, thus saying that helpless, poverty-stricken children like Tim are more deserving to live than miserly rich people like Scrooge, as Tim is harmless and brings joy and happiness, while Scrooge is harmful and causes misery and distress. So the lexical word choices of religion is used with a reference to heaven and God to allow Scrooge to reflect on the afterlife, so the life after he's died, as his punishment will be with God. So the imagery, the religious imagery, or the lexical word choice of religion is also used to show that God, a higher position than Scrooge, gave life to the poor for them to live, and people like Scrooge have no right to argue otherwise. Throughout the novella, we see religious imagery being used as a ploy to inspire change both in Scrooge as well as the Victorian audience at large. Scrooge bent before the ghost's rebuke and trembling cast his eyes upon the ground, but he raised them speedily on hearing his own name. Mr. Scrooge, said Bob, I'll give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of this feast. So Bob is saying, almost like thanking, holding a toast for Scrooge, thanking him for giving him the money to be able to produce the food on this Christmas day. The founder of the feast indeed, cried Mrs. Cratchit, reddening. I wish I had him here. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast upon, and I hope he'd have a good appetite for it. So Mrs. Cratchit is a representation of the working class mother and wife who realises the injustice and inequality of people like Scrooge and appears very angry by Scrooge's meagreness as an employer. Mrs. Cratchit's anger could be symbolic of the anger that the poor felt towards the rich due to their terrible and unfair treatment. So she sees the injustice in the way Scrooge treats Bob as an employee. My dear, said Bob, the children, Christmas Day. It should be Christmas Day, I am sure, said she, on which one drinks the health of such an odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man as Mr. Scrooge. You know he is, Robert. Nobody knows it better than you do, poor fellow. My dear, was Bob's mild answer, Christmas Day. "I'll drink his health for your sake and the day's," said Mrs. Cratchit, "not for his. Long life to him, a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. He'll be very merry and very happy, I have no doubt." The children drank the toast after her. It was the first of their proceedings which had no heartiness. Tiny Tim drank it last of all, but he didn't care twopence for it. Scrooge was the ogre of the family. The mention of his name cast a dark shadow on the family, which was not dispelled for a full 5 minutes. So obviously throughout this whole passage we've seen the optimism and the gratitude of the Cratchits, but as soon as Scrooge's name is mentioned it seems to cast a really dark shadow and have a really pessimistic, a really a really sort of sad, devastating effects on the family, but it doesn't last very long, so for a full 5 minutes. After it had passed away, they were 10 times merrier than before from the mere relief of Scrooge, the baleful being done with. Bob Cratchit told them how he had a situation in his eye for Master Peter, which would bring in, if obtained, full 5 and 6pence weekly. The young Cratchits laughed tremendously at the idea of Peter's being a man of business, and Peter himself looked thoughtfully at the fire from between his collars, as if he were deliberating what particular investments he should favour when he came into the receipt of that bewildering income. So it's only 5 and 6pence, which is not very much at all, but he's thinking about how amazing it would be to receive this amount of money. Let's carry on reading, and I'll comment on the employment of Peter and Martha. Martha, who was a poor apprentice at a milliner's, then told them what kind of work she had to do, and how many hours she worked at a stretch, and how she meant to lie abed tomorrow morning for a good long rest, tomorrow being a holiday she passed at home. Also how she had seen a countess and a lord some days before, and how the lord was much about as tall as Peter, at which Peter pulled up his collars so high that you couldn't have seen his head if you had been there. All this time the chestnuts and the jug went round, and by they had a song about a lost child travelling in the snow, from Tiny Tim, who had a plaintive little voice, and sang it very well indeed. There is an emphasis on the expectation here of children to behave like adults, which creates quite an upsetting contrast with the image of the excitable, polite young Cratchits that we saw earlier stuffing the spoon into their mouths. So Dickens has allowed us to see the children being children before we hear Martha's report of hard work and see Peter's filling with pride at the thought of himself in an adult working role. So again, it's quite distressing and upsetting to see that we saw how excited and innocent and childlike they were previously, but all of a sudden it's as if they've become adults, really living adult lives, and having adult responsibilities, and it seems very, very unfair. There was nothing of high mark in this. So I'm going to ask you a question, and you can answer this question in the comment box. Why do you think Dickens states there was nothing of high mark in the Cratchits? One suggestion that I'm going to give is it could suggest that the Cratchits represent thousands of poor families, so it's also a reference to their ordinary situation. So Scrooge seems to be struck by their happiness and unity despite their poverty, and it's quite normal, it's very normalised that they have these feelings. They were not a handsome family. They were not well dressed. Their shoes were far from being waterproof. Their clothes were scanty, and Peter might have known, and very likely did, the inside of a pawnbroker's. But they were happy, grateful, pleased with one another, and contented with the time. And when they faded and looked happier yet in the bright sprinklings of the spirit's torch at parting, Scrooge had his eye upon them, and especially on Tiny Tim, until the last. So we'll finish here. In the next video we will carry on with stave 3, but for now you can make notes on the inside the revision booklet. So it's the section called stave 3 Cratchit Christmas, and we've already made these notes from the previous video, so I'll just scroll up. You might want to pause right here so that you can make notes of all of these quotations that we've got here. So Mrs. Cratchit, Cratchit's wife, dressed out but poorly in a twice turned gown, threadbare clothes, darned up and brushed, Tim's active little crutch. So let's just delete that part. Universal admiration, God bless us everyone, Bob held his withered little hand, overcome with penitence and grief. Will you decide what men shall live, what men shall die? We've also got a little bit here on context, so I'm just going to zoom in a tiny bit so that you can see it a bit more because the writing is a little bit small. So you might want to pause this section here as well so that you can write this inside your scroll section of the booklet. Many of the rich in the 19th century believed that poor people were poor because they were lazy, so they were often called idle and lazy. However, the Cratchits challenge these stereotypical notions of the poor as they are seen to be extremely hardworking and attentive. Tiny Tim represents the poverty and health issues that the poor faced as a result of low income and the lack of help they received from the government. Dickens subtly criticises child labour but also shows how hard-working the children in poor families are, again challenging the stereotypical ideas that the richer classes had of the poor. So thank you so much for joining me again today. Please remember, if you are finding these sessions useful, then please remember to like, comment and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you so much. Bye bye.